And we'll start for real after 7 p.m. Eastern in about 5-6 minutes. And we'll start for real after 7 p.m. Eastern. Oh, I see some repeat offenders here. I don't know, guys. I don't know what that means. It either means that they didn't get it the first time or they had so much fun they had to come back for more. I'm not sure. Mustafa, I am honored to be in your home. Just don't eat all your cookies, says Peter Bromberg. Dude, I'm keto. I don't eat cookies. I eat burgers. I eat ribeye. I don't eat cookies. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Don. Thank you for sponsoring the desk shows. Thanks to DevExpress. These guys are so awesome. They just want to do good things. And they do. They do good things. Mark from the Louisville show. Hey man, how you doing? Good to see you. Very good to see you. We had fun in Louisville. Wish we could have stayed to do more, tours and things, but schedules being what they are. Oh, well, Peter, if the cookies are almond flour and they have no sugar, then okay, I will partake of them. But sadly, if you can upload them to me, I would be happy to taste them. So, more bourbon. You know, it is 7 p.m. here, but that's all right. I want to speak with a clear head tonight. I'll have my bourbon and Cuban cigar after the event. Yeah, I'm so glad we're doing this too. There's so many people that we let down by canceling the show, and I feel bad about it, but I figure it was the right thing to do. We all think it was the right thing to do. We went out on this road show and we had scheduled events all across the United States. We got about halfway through it, right, John? We got about halfway through it, and we were in Portland and just decided, you know what, this thing is becoming, it's going to be a pandemic soon. And I came down with a cough, a dry cough, which was, and I still have it. It is one of the symptoms of the coronavirus. And I just said, you know what, I'm not going to get up in front of a bunch of people and cough and spit and, sneeze into tissues and stuff and then shake their hands. There's no way I'm going to do that. So we canceled it, and we've been working on this just about ever since. We knew the world was going to go online, and now all the conferences are canceled. They're all going online. NDC is all online. I'm doing workshops, Blazor workshops, NDC, all of them pretty much, and they're all online. Julian Bucknell from DevExpress. All right, so we have 3 DevExpress people in the audience tonight. We have Don Webier. He's in Amsterdam. We have John Martin. He's in Orlando right now. And we have Julian Bucknell. And Julian is in Los Angeles, I think. Right, Julian? Yep. And yeah, and that's it. So I guess it's time for us to start because it's 2 minutes after. It's 2 minutes after. All right, here we go. So I'd like to officially welcome you to Carl Franklin's Blazor Desk Show. This is the 3rd one. We're doing a whole bunch of them. We'll do them as long as people keep signing up and people keep coming back. So this was the Blazor Roadshow, obviously, as I said before. But we decided to do it online because that's what everybody else is doing. Actually, we decided first before everybody else started doing this online stuff. It was pretty obvious that that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to share everything I know about Blazor. Be prepared to drink from the fire hose. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to learn. However, don't feel like you have to learn it and grok it all right now. There is a hands-on lab and this slideshow, which you can download right now at blazordeskshow.com. And yeah, we all want to know it all. So just stick with me. You'll learn it. I'm going to teach you. This is all good. But go to Blazor Desk Show right now, and I'm going to wait for you to go, because what you can do right now is download a zip file that has the code that you're going to see, right? It has the projects. It also has a hands-on lab, which is essentially a document you can scroll through with images and code that you can copy and paste into Visual Studio, step-by-step instructions of how to recreate the big project that I've done and that I'm going to show off today called Band Booker. And it along the way, it is essentially everything that I'm teaching you today, but in a document form. So you can go there right now. There's no authentication required. Just go. There's a link to it. Download it. Also, there's a link to download the free Blazor controls that Developer Express has made available for you. And you can essentially, if you go to devexpress.com/free Blazor, and these guys will put the link in the chat room, go there now, download it. It's free. It won't be free forever, but they're free right now, and you can use them forever. You can use what you download right now forever. There's no limitation on the free license that they're offering right now. Great controls, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more at the end of the talk today. So, long story short, a lot of information. Don't worry about having to remember all the links and everything. You can download all this stuff later. So let's talk about Blazor itself. What is it? Well, it started out as Steve Sanderson's realization that there was this thing called WebAssembly, a virtual machine, cross-platform built into every browser. And a lot of, there was a few companies that were building languages for it and compiling directly to it so that you could run binary executables in the browser with the same security parameters as JavaScript has. Okay? So he said, well, if we can do this, maybe what we should think of is a way to run C# code in the browser on WebAssembly. And he did this basically proof of concept project and showed it off in Oslo a couple of years ago. And people went nuts because they realized the value. If we could run C# code in the browser on this standard WebAssembly, which isn't, the same as Silverlight, and I'll get to that point in a minute. That point right there. It isn't the same as Silverlight. It's not a plugin model. This is a standard that everybody agrees is the way to go forward because it's secure. And it's just as secure as JavaScript, but we can compile our own binaries for it. So people went nuts for that, and that was the promise of what Blazor was. And then later on, the team, Dan Roth, who's going to be with us later, he and Ryan Nowak and some other guys on the team, they basically said, well, you know what? There's a component model here that will not only work in WebAssembly, but will also work on the server to sort of, provide the same kind of low-code experience that web forms gave our developers in the past. And maybe we can leverage this component model to work in both hosting scenarios. And so that's really what Blazor is. I mean, yes, there's WebAssembly. There's, the WebAssembly version, which is in preview right now. But the server version, the server-side Blazor, is baked. It's in .NET Core 3 right now. If you download the latest Visual Studio 2019, even the free community edition, and you create a new Blazor application, you can create a Blazor server app. And it's there. It's in .NET Core 3. Okay? So you can take that same component model, not the same project per se, but the same markup and code, and compile them to a DLL, let's say, an assembly, load them up in a client-side Blazor project, or just copy the files, right? Or add a reference to the files like we'll talk about later. And that same markup and code will run in the browser as it runs today on the server. So the hosting models are obviously different. The Blazor client is in preview. You need a few extra things to download in order to get that to work today. But all the code, all the C# code runs in the browser on top of WebAssembly. Blazor server, all the code runs on the server, but it's the same code and same markup, the same component model. And it runs with magic. And of course, it's SignalR is the magic, but it does feel like magic. It's really the secret magic sauce that brings it all together and makes the same component model work on both on the server as it does in the client. Now, you really can't combine these models, nor would you want to, because seriously, this is a UI framework, okay? This isn't a framework for calling APIs. Like we have that. we know what APIs are. Okay, so if there's code that's running on the server, we make it into an API and we call it, no problem. And we can call it from Blazor. But you can call an API from Blazor server as you can call it from Blazor client. So this is really about a UI framework. Think Angular, think React, think Vue. It's a SPA UI framework, but instead of using JavaScript, we're using C#. And I know that strikes a chord with people. How many people think JavaScript sucks? Just give me some noise out on the chat room. Down with JavaScript. Okay. I use JavaScript all the time. All right. Yeah, I know. Yeah, me. I use JavaScript a lot. I've been doing JavaScript for what, 15 years now? It's like 20 years. It's been a reality, but JavaScript was never meant to be an enterprise quality or an enterprise level language. It was a script language built for the Netscape browser in a weekend. A weekend. And it has so many problems that a guy like Doug Crockford has to write a book this thick called JavaScript, The Good Parts, in order for us to understand, how to get around its shortcomings. And that's essentially what that book was. And, what's a decimal in JavaScript? Oh my God, right? So JavaScript has become this very lingua franca, very much, of the web, but it also was never really equipped to be all that we've asked it to be. And yes, the bad parts were bigger. So the reason that WebAssembly is not Silverlight, let's talk about that. I can understand why people conflate Blazor's or WebAssembly's future with Silverlight's past. I can understand that. But it is an ill-informed comparison, because the reason that Silverlight isn't being used today, and the reason why Flash isn't being used today, isn't because they were bad platforms per se, but because they were brought into the browser on the back of this plugin model. And the plugin model was the real problem. It was insecure. People were introducing malware into the browser by way of the plugin model, because the plugin model was a way that you could run trusted code in the browser, right? And there wasn't much of a sandbox there. And so essentially what happened was Steve Jobs basically said, our iPhone and iPad users are seeing a serious battery drain when they're using Flash. And not only that, but they're getting all this malware and stuff. No, we can't have that. So we're shutting down the plugin model for iOS. So that meant iPhones and iPads could no longer host plugins. Well, Silverlight used the same plugin model as Flash. It's the plugin model. It's the only thing that was available in the browser right back then. And so it was a casualty, really, of that decision. And so that is the only similarity, in that they both ran C# code in the browser with markup. But that alone isn't why we don't use Silverlight today. It was really the plugin model, and it was really Flash that was the problem. It wasn't Silverlight. I don't even think Steve Jobs cared about Silverlight at the time, because it had, it was getting traction, but it really wasn't a big problem like Flash was. So if you want to install, if you want to create a Blazor server application today, just run Visual Studio 2019. It's there. But if you want to run a WebAssembly application, you need to install .NET Core SDK 3.1. Need to install the latest Visual Studio 2019. The Community Edition, which is free, works just fine. Install the Blazor WebAssembly template, and that is a command line execution. There's detailed instructions here at this link, but if you just Google Bing, getting started with Blazor, Microsoft, and look for the docs, they'll tell you exactly what to do. There's only a couple of steps and it takes 5 minutes. All right, so these two hosting models, let's compare them side by side. The Blazor server hosting model, as I said before, uses kind of this magic to do the plumbing back and forth between the browser and the server, and the code all runs on the server, right? The magic is SignalR. And SignalR provides a persistent WebSocket connection between the browser and the server. Excuse me. Between the browser and the server. And this persistent socket connection is very much unlike an HTTP connection, in which the browser makes a socket connection to a server over port 80, sends an HTTP request, the server sends back an HTTP response, and then severs the socket connection. Whereas in SignalR, a connection is made and it stays open. And then client can send to server, server can send to client. There's push, obviously, because the server can send to the client. That's the way sockets work. It's a persistent connection. Now, if you've done any SignalR programming in the past, you'll probably know, and I have this I have this graphic here. You probably know that SignalR is really best used when you're doing a one-to-many kind of broadcast scenario, right? So let's say, the canonical example is a chat application. So in a chat application on the web, you type some things, and we send that string up to a hub, and the hub has a lot of other clients connected to it, and then that hub method sends and broadcasts that message to all of the other clients. But this is different. This is a one-to-one client-to-server persistent connection. So it's a little bit different, and it uses a few more layers of technology than just raw HTTP. But what that gives us is this reliable connection that's always open. And this is really key. And they've essentially abstracted all of that HTTP goo away from us by doing this. So let me show you, and I'll just pull this up here. I'm going to go up to my server, and let's create a new Blazor application in Visual Studio, and I'll call it Blazor Server. And this is, like I said, Visual Studio 2019 preview. So this is the community edition. It doesn't require, I didn't pay for it. It's a free download, right? So because I've installed that template, I have the opportunity to create a Blazor WebAssembly application, but I'm not. I'm going to create a server app. We'll do a WebAssembly application later. So right out of the box, and if I just run this, you get 3 pages, and that's fine. Usually by the second time it works. You get 3 pages. You get a home page, which is some static information. You get a counter page, and you get this fetch data page, which gets some data from a service. So here's your static information. Here's a counter where we can increment by a counter by clicking a button, click me. And then this fetch data, which goes out and gets some data from a service. Now, that service can be an API call. In this case, we're on the server, so this is essentially just a local class that retrieves some data because we're on the server. We don't need to go through an API. Now, let's go back to the counter page. Oh, and notice that when I went back to the counter page, the current count reverted to 0. Remember that when we talk about state. But going back in here and going to my pages, look at the code behind the counter page. So we have some standard HTML here. Here's a paragraph with this at current count. So that's a one-way binding, the Razor syntax that injects that variable current count right here, that value, into the HTML. And you see this @onClick equals increment count, which is defined down here in this code block. If that was just a regular onClick without @ that would be a JavaScript onClick event, but it's got an @ sign, so Blazor picks that up. There's a JavaScript file that gets loaded in the browser, and it hooks the DOM and says, oh, that's a Blazor directive. I'm going to call that, make a call through the socket connection, the SignalR connection, and say, hey, the user clicked this button. And so then the server says, oh, well, I see that is an increment count, and therefore I'm going to call that. So it updates that variable, and now it notices that something in the UI has changed. And the way it knows that is because there's a graph of the DOM of every client on the server. And so after running the code on the server, there's a comparison that's done in the graph of the DOM. And whatever the difference is, in other words, whatever the changes were, get essentially packaged up in a binary message and sent back to the browser. And the browser says, I need to update this paragraph right here with this variable, with this value. And all of that happens just magically. So yes, you can put a breakpoint here. And if I click the counter button, I have debugging in Visual Studio. It's really a wonderful thing. Now, get this. Let's do another thing here. Let me get rid of my counter button. Let's actually take a look at the traffic that's going over HTTP and over SignalR, okay? So I'm going to press F12, and I'll get the network page up here, the tools. Notice that I've disabled the cache. I don't want any cache going on. And I'm going to click the record button to monitor all the traffic. And I'll go to counter, and I'll press Control F5. So let's take a look at what was transferred here. And I press Control F5 because I want to refresh anew. I don't want anything cached, whatever. We only transferred like 161K and not a whole lot of data, right? But look at this, underscore Blazor question mark ID equals bloggity bloggity blah 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 blah. And this is a WebSocket. So this right here is the SignalR traffic, and you can't necessarily watch the actual data. You'd have to log that, and I can show you how to do that. But it'll show you how much data was transferred. So when I click that button, 291 bytes were sent to the server. Okay, that is the Blazor JavaScript hooking the DOM click element and saying, oh, we need to send a message through our SignalR to the server. It sends this binary message, 291 bytes. The server gets that, executes increment count, right? And then it does the diff of the DOM and says, oh, there's a difference here. There's something you need to update. That's this message right here, that we're receiving, right? Green is sending, red is receiving. And then the browser sends back 27 bytes. Now, I don't know exactly what that is, but I'm imagining that's like, got it. We're updated, Everything's cool here. So not a whole lot of data being sent and received. All right, if we go back here, let's continue and talk about, this is exactly what I just showed you. Let's talk about scaling. So what are the things that we need to think about when we're building a server-side Blazor application and we want to scale? We want to be able to support as many concurrent clients as possible. Well, memory is the biggest barrier. The memory of your server, okay? There's a minimum of 85K, at least there was when I did my research, 85K memory required just to support the overhead of every single client, right? So if you've got 1,000 clients, you've got 8.5 megabytes of data of memory that needs to be used for those clients, and that's just a minimum. That's without any of your data. So now let's say that you pull out from your data set 100,000, 500,000 rows of data that are that's about a megabyte. Well, now you've added a megabyte of required memory for every single client, right? So you got to be careful with that. You got to use controls that do paging and that do virtualization. So you're only, the rule should be what you're showing on the screen should be the only data that's in memory at the time. And of course there are violations and variations, but you got to have that mentality that, oh, I can't just pull up 1,000,000 rows, you know, and then let the user do filtering and filter it down. You want to let them filter and then only give them the first page of what the filtered set looks like. You know what I'm saying? So just be mindful of the memory as you're building your Blazor server-side applications. WebSockets are another resource that could run out. And the number of available WebSockets in SignalR is dependent on memory and CPU. Now, if you want to completely remove the SignalR service from your server, you can do that. You can use Azure SignalR service, and there's a link here to a GitHub repo where they show you exactly how to do that by setting up the Azure SignalR service in Azure and then getting your secret connection string and tying that into your application, and then poof, you no longer have SignalR as a memory constraint or a CPU constraint in your server application. It is now offset to the Azure SignalR service. Good stuff. So ironically, Dan Roth is going to be joining us at the end or a little bit later on in the evening, and I completely stole this slide from him from .NET Conf. And maybe he can tell you more of the details, but from what I gathered, they did a test at Microsoft for appropriate latency. So they wanted to see how far they could push a particular server before they got above 200 milliseconds for a UI transaction under load. And this wasn't a counter button. This was a real application. So it had real data. And I think I remember Ryan saying there was like 165K of overhead per client in this demo application, but I'm not sure. But it was definitely under 200K, but it was right around there somewhere. And so they found that using a virtual machine that had one virtual CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM, they could handle 5,000 concurrent clients comfortably. Getting that under 200 millisecond response latency. But if they up that to 4 virtual CPUs and 14 gigs of RAM, then they got around 20,000 comfortable concurrent clients with appropriate latency. And this was not using Azure SignalR service. This is what's in the box. So yeah, available memory, definitely the primary bottleneck. And maybe when Dan comes on later, he can answer questions about those, about this test and what exactly they did. But this is pretty compelling to me. That's not bad, right? I mean, your standard, and by the standard, I mean just like the default kind of, I don't even know if it's the default, but a standard web app service in Azure can handle 5,000 concurrent users. That's pretty good. So let's talk about the upsides and the downsides of this hosting model, the server-side hosting model. By the way, you guys with me? Are you snoozing? You got your bourbon, you got your scotch, your whiskey. Are you with me? Your beer? All right, cool. Because it's just getting good now. Okay. All right, awesome. So we're comparing the server and the client-side model, and we haven't talked about the client-side model yet, but we've talked about feeling a bit sleepy. Surly Dev, you've been to every single one of these sessions today. Of course you're feeling a little bit sleepy. Drink some coffee, man. All right, so let's talk about the benefits of the server-side model. Download size, very small. As you saw, very, very small. Significantly smaller than a client-side app. And the app loads very fast. All the code is running on the server, and that means several good things. First of all, oh wow, Beth Massey is here. We use SignalR for the .NET Conf website while we're broadcasting. We have no problems, usually about 3,000 to 4,000 concurrent and 20 to 100,000 total connections. Wow, cool. Beth Massey's here. All right, so I'm sorry. Back to what I was talking about. All your code runs on the server, so there's a couple of benefits there. First of all, you have access to everything that you can load in Visual Studio and run in Azure. Awesome, right? You've got access to all the debugging tools in Visual Studio that you normally use for web applications. This is great. You don't have to worry that the browser doesn't support WebAssembly, and there's only a couple of browsers that there's an issue with. But, you know, somebody running on a BlackBerry, you don't have to worry about that, right? It's going to work just fine, especially for them. Also, and this is a problem for some people, I don't understand why really, but the code isn't shipped into the browser. And some people think that's a problem. I don't think it's a problem any more than it's a problem with JavaScript, right? You don't send secrets to the browser. In JavaScript, you don't have sensitive code running in JavaScript in the browser. You don't have sensitive code running in C# in the browser either. All right, just because it's in an assembly doesn't mean that it can't be decompiled. So treat it the same as JavaScript. I'm talking about client side now. All right, so it's not an issue. In my book, anyway. So the downsides of Blazor Server, a little bit of latency is added for each UI interaction because we have to now go through that SignalR hub to the server. The server has to execute code. The diff has to come down to the browser and it needs to update. So if you have a slow internet connection or you have a bad internet connection, even worse, you're going to have problems. And latency is going to be there if you've got a slow internet connection. So you just got to think about those things. Therefore, you might be thinking now, well, if I'm going to do a Blazor server application, I better be sure that the people that are using it have access to good, solid internet. Well, that means, you know, corporations like enterprises behind the firewall, people who are working from home from really good, solid internet, right? That is what we're talking about here. Scalability. Oh, offline support. There's no offline support. As I said before, if the internet goes down, you're screwed. You have to have an internet connection just to do basic UI stuff. So, I mean, that's kind of the case with every web application, but it's even more so with Blazor Server because all the UI is dependent on an internet connection. Scalability, we already talked about that, memory and WebSockets. That is an issue. And an ASP.NET Core application is required to serve the app. You can't just, like you can do with an HTML and JavaScript and CSS file, you can just send it to somebody and they can run it, right? You can do with a Blazor WebAssembly application, you can just send somebody the application or distribute it via a CDN and it's going to run. You can't do that with Blazor Server. You have to have an ASP.NET Core server. All right, so does anybody have any questions? And Beth is out there. I'm here. I think Dan Roth is on the line somewhere. If you have any questions about this particular model, and Dan will be here to answer your questions in person a little bit later. But if you have any questions on this model right now, now would be a good time to ask them. And John Galloway is here. Oh, my God. All the Microsofties came out. It is a party. Should I get some bourbon? Is it that kind of party? No, it's like afternoon for you guys. That's okay. I'm not going to do that. But we are going to pause to let people ask questions about the server-side model before I move on to the client-side model. If you're using WebSockets and you use something like RabbitMQ to see connections, are there tools like that to see all the connections? Are you talking about using RabbitMQ in between the browser and the server for UI? Is that what you're talking about, Ducky Burke? Because that doesn't make any sense to me. You would use RabbitMQ to see all the connections via SignalR. Oh, okay. No. If we go back to my presentation here, there is where is it? I wrote this blog post about logging traffic in SignalR server-side Blazor. And that's what you can use. So this is a good blog post. It shows you how to set up logging, and then you can actually watch the communication between your clients and you. So that's what I would use. Other questions? I assume this requires Visual Studio 2019. Will Visual Studio 2019 run on Windows 7? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Dan or Beth can answer that question. And that was a question from YouTube. And I believe Dan and Beth are over on Twitch. So I will pass over their answers. Oh no, Dan is also on YouTube. Okay, good. So let's answer that question. You guys are just having too much fun socially. Let's answer this guy's question. The question was, or did Dan already answer it? Now I've lost it. Oh, I assume this requires Visual Studio 2019. Will VS 2019 run on Windows 7? I don't see why not. Will it? Will Visual Studio 2019 run on Windows 7? You guys? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it will. I don't see why it wouldn't. But we'll let these guys answer. Yeah. Then again, there's the Google Bings to answer that question, right? Okay, let's move on. So let's talk about the Blazor client hosting model. So this is quite easy and simpler than the server hosting model, which does the SignalR stuff in between for each UI interaction. Of course, we don't need that because all the code is executing in the browser. But let's talk about WebAssembly for a minute. WebAssembly is a virtual machine. It's a cross-platform virtual machine that's baked into every browser that is currently being worked on. Okay, and John Galloway says Windows 7 SP1 with latest Windows updates, Home Premium, Professional, Enterprise, Ultimate. So you're good. So every browser that is currently being worked on and currently being supported, IE 11 being one of the major ones that has been stopped, however people are still using it, doesn't support WebAssembly. But that's because Microsoft moved to Edge. Edge is their answer to Internet Explorer. All right. But some companies are still using IE11. So if you're using IE11, you're going to need some polyfills. However, you can use Blazor Server, but not Blazor Client. Okay, just about every other browser in the world, including Safari on the iPhone, okay, supports WebAssembly. So as I said, it's a virtual machine. Now, unlike other, and I think I already said this, but unlike other languages that compile directly to the binary WebAssembly, Blazor is a CLR that is compiled to WebAssembly. So there's a mono version of the CLR that's compiled to WebAssembly, and then it loads assemblies on top of that, .NET assemblies. And those .NET assemblies can be anything so long as they conform to .NET Standard 2. That is just about everything that you're going to be using today. All right, but there are some things like that are Windows specific that are obviously aren't going to run. So you need to get to .NET Standard 2, and all of that code can run easily in the browser with Blazor Client. So just like we did before with Blazor Server, let us go up to the code here and create and add actually to this solution a WebAssembly application, WebAssembly project, and let's watch that in the browser and see the difference. So I'm going to call this project Blazor WASM. I don't know, it just came to me. So this is going to be a WebAssembly application. And look at this. I'm going to check this off right here, an ASP.NET Core hosted. And by doing that, I'm going to get three projects. I'm going to get a client project, which if I didn't check this off, I'd just get the WebAssembly project. But I'm also going to get a server application that hosts that and serves that assembly project. Then I'm also going to get another project that's a shared, essentially, library, a shared .NET Standard library, and that's where models will go. So you'll see here in a second, it's going to add 3 projects. Here's my Blazor WASM client that runs in the browser with my pages and everything, Blazor. Here's my server application, which is just an ASP.NET 3 Core 3 application, but it has controllers. So this is great. And this is a place where I can add API controllers that the client can access without having to specify a specific URL. It's in the same URL space, and therefore it doesn't require cores or anything crazy like that. And shared, let me get out of the way here. Shared is where my models go, like the weather forecast, right? So there are these 3 projects that we get. Now I'm going to set Blazor WASM Server as the startup project, and I'll run this puppy. It's going to look a lot like the server project because the code is just about the same. It's a little bit different, but you'll see why, and it's understandable why. So here's my counter, just as before. Here's my fetch data, and everything looks good. What I'm going to do now is press F12 to bring up the network tools, just like I did before. Again, disable the cache and start recording. And I'll press Control F5. And let's see how much data was transferred. So Control F5 is obviously like, no caching. Get everything as if this was the first time. I want to reload everything. 2.1 megs. Anybody got a problem with 2.1 megabytes? Ever used Angular? How about Gmail? Gmail is about 5 megabytes. 2 bananas. All right. So 2.1 megabytes is the hit that you take the first time you load a Blazor WebAssembly application. And that's just now. They're always trying to chisel that down. And it was even bigger when they started. Done a great job of paring that down. But all SPA frameworks have this hit, this load, this front load of code that has to run on the client. It's just a fact of life. And this is pretty good. But let's take a look at what these actually are. The biggest file is this, .NET WASM. All right, that's 828K. That is the CLR. That's the CLR. That's the mono-based CLR that is compiled to WebAssembly. It's got a WASM extension. And then that hosts in managed environment, because it's the CLR, it manages code, all of our WebAssemblies. All of our .NET assemblies. So that's a lot different. Now, also, if I click here, you'll notice that there's no interaction here. That's because the code is running in the client. All right, now what about debugging? Actually, the answer to this question just changed today. But currently, and by currently I mean yesterday, if you put a breakpoint right here on increment count and press the button here, nothing happens. It doesn't break because Visual Studio debugging is not enabled in the preview as of yesterday. However, today, Microsoft announced a refresh of WebAssembly that gives you rudimentary debugging in Visual Studio, so that breakpoint would hit. It also gives you, and I won't say it's a hot loading, but you can make changes to the code, and then in the server version, I believe, and Dan will correct me on this, and yeah, I'm kind of old school. And then as the changes are made, by the time you hit refresh in the browser, everything will change and it will be updated. So that's good. Really good stuff. Okay. Let's go back to the slides. So let's talk about the upsides and the downsides. The upsides of the client-side model: the code executes more quickly in the browser, so you don't have that extra hop, the latency added by the SignalR interaction. Your code can run even when not connected to the internet, so you download the application, everything can run so long as it doesn't need to go off and get anything. But even then, you can use a progressive web app to sort of fill in and mock those services, so you can actually run an entire application offline. I think a progressive web application plus Blazor client is like beautiful. It's like the perfect marriage of web technology, C#, and mobile technology. It's a really good solution. Of course, you can distribute any client-side Blazor application via CDN, and any .NET Standard 2.0 C# code will run in the browser, as I said before. Downsides: you need to protect sensitive code, and the way to do that is with an API. When was the last time you sent a connection string down in JavaScript to your browser and allowed them to just load up that connection and start getting data? No, that never happens. You use an API for that. So essentially anything that requires credentials, like a database connection, like any kind of Azure resource that requires you to log in, that's going to have to be done from a server side, and you're going to need to abstract that away with an API layer. Now, there are other ways to do it. You can use gRPC, but you're still going to have to write something on the server and hide all those credentials from the client. There's no way that we are going to send our passwords and our keys and all of that stuff to the client. You know, unless it's something that can happen automatically and go right to local storage, and the user has no way to mess with it. Now, I said in this slide, debugging in Visual Studio not yet baked. That was as of yesterday. I didn't want to go get the preview and completely redo all my code, you know, with hours before my presentation. So I'm going to do that over the weekend with the new preview and update this code. So if you download it by Tuesday, it should be current. So in May, I had this conversation with Dan Roth earlier today. So in May, it will be baked. And what I mean by that is all of the your projects that you create in Visual Studio will still work in the release version. Okay, so all of the sort of the plumbing behind the scenes is going to be set in stone. The component model right now is baked. So the component model that runs in server and client, that isn't going to change. The syntax for all of the stuff you're going to see here today that we do in Blazor is already cemented. It isn't going to change. But the rest of the stuff, the underlying things, in May will be set in stone. And then Blazor WebAssembly client, Blazor client will be shipped as part of .NET 5 in November, which is essentially .NET Core and .NET Windows sort of all wrapped into it. It's the open source. Everything combines into one big explosion. Yeah, it's the big one, Elizabeth. So your code is shipped to the client again. I don't think this is a real downside, but some people think this is. Just don't write sensitive code in C# and send it to the browser. That's all, just like you would do with JavaScript. It's sandbox. It's in the same boat. All right, so does anybody have any questions on Blazor WebAssembly? And I noticed that you guys have been answering a lot of questions on Twitch, and I'm sure as well on YouTube. So I'll just give you a minute to catch up with those questions. Blazor Mr. Magoo is here. You're the guy who does the PWA control, right? That's good stuff. Really good. That 2.8 megs or 2.1 that is downloaded initially, is that cache for all Blazor sites or apps that you might visit and use? That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but maybe Dan does. My initial thought is no, because you know, site A might have different requirements than site B. Dan's answer is typically you download the runtime and framework pieces you need with each app. Often you'll run the framework through the IL linker to remove unneeded IL, so it won't be customized to the app. So yeah, so the answer is no. It's on a per site basis, but what he's saying is the linker is on by default, so it's going to exclude all of the parts of the framework that you're not using in your code. Humberto says, is there a switch for .NET New-I for ignoring one or more NuGet package sources, or to provide credentials for, say, our organization repo on Azure DevOps? While somebody else is answering that question, there's another newbie question. Can you run an app in the browser with a client-side database? Yes. Yes, you can. And you can always default to, first of all, you can run any .NET standard 2 interface, right? But you can always default to local storage. Yeah, and Dan WeBA says, there are some experiments to run a DB client side, but nothing out of the box yet. So yeah, it's like documents, you know. You can persist JSON files, that kind of thing. There are corporations out there that aren't abandoning IE 11 anytime soon. Any plans to add a plugin or something to enable this support? Yeah, so no, there are polyfills to be able to support Blazor server, but I don't, and Dan, you can answer this, but I think the answer is no. IE 11 is done. I mentioned that debugging is, as of yesterday, available. Maybe you mentioned it, but is that update coming in May, or can we use it before that? No, you can use it now. There was just a drop that happened today. So if you just search for Microsoft Blazor, you know, getting started or whatever, you'll see all of the new stuff that happened and shipped today. So there was a preview update today of Blazor WebAssembly. Okay, good stuff. Let's move on. And I guarantee Dan will be here to answer your questions in real time in a little bit. All right, let's talk about binding. So binding is one of those things that the component model, the Blazor component model, has greatly simplified. And if you've ever done any Angular binding or even Knockout binding or Vue or React, you're going to see some similarities and a whole lot of simplicity. Now, I'm not going to read this slide to you. Instead, I'm going to show you the code itself, and we're just going to do some binding stuff. So I'm going to go back to Blazor server. I'm going to set that as my startup project. Let's just get rid of everything here. And we'll go to my pages and index, and I'm just going to delete this static stuff and show my toolbox where I've got some code here that I'm just going to pull in. So here we have in the code block a private message string property set to two-way bound message. And I'm showing that in a one-way binding right here. You can think of it like a label, but it's in a heading, at message. And then I have this input tag. And the input tag uses this at bind equals message syntax. So this is as simple as it gets. This is basically saying bind the message property to the default property of input. Now, if I wanted to be a little more explicit, I could define the property itself. Value happens to be the default property of the input tag. So I don't need to specify it, but if I wanted to, I could. All right, so I'm going to say, I'm going to change this. I'm going to call it changed, and then I'm going to tab off of it, which fires the onChanged event. And the onChanged event is the default event that causes the change that updates the UI. So once I hit tab, then everything changes. But if I am too impatient and I want to change the event that triggers the binding mechanism to update all the UI, then I can specify that with @bind::event equals, and for example, I could say on input, which means every key press. So now every time I press a key, this message will change, which will update this binding right here. Pretty cool? And guess who I learned that from? Dan Roth. Very good. Okay, so let's create a component now. And the component is going to have a property that we're going to bind to. And we're going to be able to change the property from within the component. And it will ripple up to the parent. All right, so I'm going to add a new item to my pages folder. And this is how you add either a component or a page. It's a Razor component. And I'm going to call it child component. And child component is going to have a div at the top. And there's going to be a little padding and a light gray background color so I can tell that it is actually a component. And I'm going to set my parent message here in a variable in a one-way binding, right, an H2. And I've got a parent message string and a button where my on-click goes to update message. And then that is going to update the message and raise an event. So let's talk about parameters. So parameters in a component are essentially, you can think of them like control properties, like public properties. And you can set them when you instantiate the component. But then you can also define events as parameters. And look at how elegant this syntax is right here. I'm defining an event that passes a string called message changed. Okay? To invoke that event, I say await message change.invoke async and pass the string. And that's it. I don't have to do all the gobbledygook that I have to normally do in C# where I have event args and I have to inherit from them in all this object-oriented stuff. This is pretty simple. And I love that. This is just one of the great things that I love about Blazor is how they've simplified event handling. So you see what's going to happen here. Whoops. You see what's going to happen here is that when we click the button, we're going to change the parent message to Blazon and then call this event message changed. So back in the index, let's update this as well. Now we're instantiating a child component. And we're using the bind syntax to bind the parent message property to message. And we're also telling it that the event that is going to trigger that this is changed is the message changed event. I don't even have to handle that message changed event down here. I don't have to do that. All I say is, hey, when that message changed event gets raised, I want you to update the UI with this message that we're bound to. Really quite beautiful. So here we go. Updating on key press. Now it's updating here in the input, it's updating in our parent, and it's updating in the component. If I click this button here, we're going to change it from within the component, and that bubbles up into the parent as well. All right, let's talk about state. Because if you have a server-side Blazor application, let's say, and you need to scale this up, And you figure, well, rather than paying for one huge app service on Azure, I want to have a whole bunch of containers out there running smaller versions of my application, which is a smart thing to do. But in order to do that, the state has to be outside of the application. So before we can even get it outside the application, let's get it outside the page, right? And then we can talk about the application. So state is really important. And if you're a web forms developer, you might be thinking, session, right? So session is merely an abstraction over a persistent object that exists through the lifetime of your particular client's access to that session, right? So let's figure out how to do that in Blazor. And I'm going to go again up to my application. And as you saw before, when I went to the counter page, right? And I hit the counter to update it. And then I went back to the home page and then went back to the counter page. It reset to 0. That's because all of these variables, all these module level variables and everything in a page gets reinitialized every time you navigate to it. So the first step is, hey, let's get the state, in other words, this current count, outside the page itself. So I can do that by first creating a class that's going to hold the state. So I'm going to add a class here, and I'm going to call it appState. And it's just going to have one property, counter. And now I'm going to go to the startup, and I'm going to add this as a scoped service. And then I'll talk about that in a minute after I'm done typing this. So you can see right up here, the weather forecast service is added as a singleton. So a singleton shares one instance of this particular class for all clients, for all instances of the application, for all clients, for all connected clients. They all use that same single instance. A scoped service has one instance per client. So now how I access that instance is through injection. So I'll go to my counter, and I'm going to inject an appState variable called appState. Now that doesn't instantiate a new instance. However, if it's a singleton, we'll use that single instance. If it's a scoped service, we're going to use that same instance that's one per client. It doesn't create a per page or a transient instance. It doesn't do that. And transient is another way you can add, and that just is, when this page is gone, it's gone. Now that I have an access to this, I can completely delete my current count. We'll figure that out in a minute, Dan. I can completely delete that, and I can use appState.counter here and appState.counter here. Okay, now I go to my counter page, I increment it, you can see it's 5 right now. I'll go to fetch data, come back to counter, and it's still 5. Okay, so now what? Well, now that you have this appState outside, now it's up to you to do something with that data. Do you want to persist it to local storage? Do you want to serialize it and send it off to a document database somewhere, which is be pretty smart? You can completely move it outside of the application, and you can retrieve it in your page after you've authenticated the user, and you have their user ID. You can go retrieve that by the user ID, repopulate the state, and whatever they were working on before is there now. And this is the solution for You know, not just for state, but for scalability, right? For scaling, for web farms and all of that stuff. Okay. Now, give me just a second to reinitialize a meeting. Because the meeting that Dan was on before ended with a timeout. So I've just got to send him a new URL. Hang on one second. All right, good. Good. All right, so getting to the end of this, there's a blog post that I did. It's a shopping cart application that uses local storage. And this is a way that you can save the state of a shopping cart in local storage and retrieve that every time you come into the application. And it even has a date, a last access date field so that you can do expiration and all that kind of stuff. So go get that. This might be the coolest thing that you're going to see today, tonight, this morning. I don't know where you are in the world. However, this I saw at NDC London. Steve Sanderson showed this. This is a way that you can develop both a Blazor server application and a Blazor client-side application simultaneously. And you may not know, based on all you've seen tonight, which horse you should hook your cart to, a server-side model or a client-side model. So you can defer that decision by doing both at the same time. And the way to do this is we have the solution that we currently have where we've got a Blazor server application and a Blazor client application. You make a reference to the client app from the server app, and then you override the app instantiation to the client version. And it's easier to just show you the code than explain, actually. So let's go do that. So what I've done here is I'm going to add a reference from Blazor server to both Blazor client and Blazor WASM shared. Right there. Okay. That's step one. Now, in the server application, there's a file called _host CS_HTML. And this is sort of the default, if you will, the first HTML that gets loaded in the browser. So you've got your head section and your links and all of that stuff. And in the body, all this stuff is for handling errors. And here's the main Blazor JavaScript file. So this is the entire application right here. A component, type of app. This app holds all of the markup and the code for your application. This is it. All of it comes down to that. So I can change this to Blazor WASM.client.app, change my render mode to server. And now when I run my server-side application, it's going to use the code and markup in the client-side application. And just to show you that I can do this, I will delete all of the Razor files in the server-side application. Just going to delete them. Boom, there they go. And now I want to run both the server and the client version at the same time. So I'm going to go to Solution Properties and select multiple server projects. And I want the Blazor server to start and the Blazor WASM server to start when I hit F5. Right? These two projects. Because this one is going to host this one. And the shared is referred to by both of them, so that just becomes part of the project itself. Now I'm going to right-click Rebuild Solution. And this is a really good way to, as I said, to hedge your bets and just defer the decision as to which hosting model that you want to do until you have, you know, enough evidence to show that yes, it's going to work best in one or the other. So remember, I deleted the markup in the code on the server side. So these are both running the code and markup from the client, except that this one is running in the browser because you can see Blazor WASM right there on the tab. And this one is running on the server. Same code and markup running in different environments. So let's see what happens. We'll go to the Blazor WASM, do the counter. Yes, we can do the counter. Yep, we can fetch data, no problem. Blazor server, we can go to the counter. Same markup, same code is running on the server. Let's go to fetch data. Oh, what happened here? Duh! An unhandled exception has occurred. See browser dev tools for details. That is a message I really want my clients to see. Just kidding, I really don't. So the moral of the story, don't write bugs, use try catch everywhere you can. Let's find out actually what the problem was. The problem was that HTTP was not found in fetch data. There's no registered service of type systemnet HTTP client. And that is by design, because on the server side, we don't need an HTTP client. We're not calling an API to fetch data. We're just going to this data weather forecast service right here and calling get forecast async because we're on the server. That's where the code is. I don't need an API, so I don't need HTTP client. But in fetch data on the client, we're calling with an HTTP client this weather forecast service, which is in my controllers folder on Blazor WASM server, weather forecast controller. And that is actually an API controller, right? Because we're fetching data. We're getting data from somewhere. If we're in Blazor server, no problem. We just get it from a class. But if we're in Blazor client, we have to make an API call. All right? So the solution to that is to just add services to services. We'll add a scoped services, add a scoped system net HTTP client. And now, because we're calling that same fetch data that is injecting an HTTP client, now we know we have access to that, okay? So let's see if that solves the problem. Looking at this code, do you think it's going to solve the problem? Yes? No? Bueller? Orange whip? Orange whip? Orange whip? It will. You think it will solve the problem? Okay. Blazor server, go to fetch data. What's the problem now? Okay, well, the problem now is that we don't understand the URI. It's an invalid request URI. Because this is the client code, we can just call that URI weather forecast without any kind of qualifier, HTTP, localhost, any kind of address, because it's in the same URL space. Yeah, base address, exactly. So in the Blazor WASM server project, we need the address, the URL of that server. And if you go to properties, launch settings, JSON, you will see the SSL port. And now what we can do is change this to a fully qualified URL, https localhost port number, SSL port, weather forecast, and both should work. So the moral of the story here is that you have to consider the environment that each of these is running in. Okay? So the environment is the browser, right? But also where it's being served from, the services that are available to that application. Here's WASM. Here's server. Okay? So they have to be the same. You have to think about those things. You know, the things that you take for granted, the shortcuts that you make when you're on server, you can't do when you're in Blazor client. But I think this sort of architecture or development pattern is really kind of cool. Really, really kind of cool. Okay, let's get to the next part. But before we do that, let's just pause for questions. And I see a question now. How do you handle cores? That's actually fairly easy to do. You basically install the cores middleware, and you specify that you want to use that. And there's some attributes that you can set, and it's really, really simple. All right, so let's look at some questions here. This is great because Dan is answering all the questions before. Another approach that I like is to update the fetch data component to use a service to get the weather forecast data, and then implement separate implementations for client and server. Yes, that's a great abstraction as well. And Don Weebier says, a demo with separate data services according to Dan Roth's suggestion is available on his GitHub repo. Good stuff, you guys. This is by far the most active chat room we've had so far, and it's great. And I think it's because of our esteemed guest. I'm not sure about that, but I just have a hunch. Okay. Let's move on to Ban Booker. Yes, authentication, authorization, I'm going to talk about right now. Not with Identity Server, but definitely with an API. But it could just as easily be Identity Server. So Ban Booker is a more complete application using Blazor, WASM, and server. It uses the same pattern that I've been showing you here, where I develop the same. I develop it all as a WASM application and then run it as a server application as well. So this grew out of necessity to help me book gigs. I have a 10-piece band, and getting them to come to rehearsal at the same time is like herding cats. Trying to get them to, agree on a gig date is even harder. So this was an application where I figured they could come in and they see all the gigs that they could potentially play, and they could accept or decline, and all of that stuff. So for these, I need models. I need, at the very least, a model of an instrument that has an instrument name. I need a musician that contains a collection of instruments, the instruments that they play. I need a band that has the band metadata plus the list of musicians that are in that band or have ever been in that band. I need a venue, which is sort of a static thing, just the information about the venue. And I need a booking, which combines a band, a venue, and a date, and a bunch of instruments, and ultimately musicians that play those instruments. So if you want to see the entire application being built in a one-day workshop, it's actually I narrowed it down to 2.5 hours, but when I do it live, it takes a whole day. You can get that hands-on lab at blazor.appvnext.com. But like I said, you can just go to blazordeskshow.com and download the band booker that I'm going to show you right now. It has 2 models, instrument and musician, and that's it. And it does CRUD operations for both of those. It also has authentication and authorization code in there, which I'll talk about in a second. So the techniques that you're going to learn by watching this demo are code behind, where we're going to use the power of the Visual Studio editor and move all of the code from those code blocks in the Razor files to CS files. You can't do things like in Visual Studio, like the refactoring. If you press Control period, for example, the refactorings don't come up in a Razor file. It's just, slightly, not slightly, it's quite a different experience than using the Visual Studio editor. We're going to do input validation based on annotations in the models. I'm going to show you how to call JavaScript. So if there are things that you can't do in Blazor, and there are a few things that you can't do right now in Blazor, you can do them in JavaScript and call into it. Also, JavaScript interop is a great way if you have an existing JavaScript widget that you want to use in a Blazor application. You can write a component that exposes properties and methods that wraps those JavaScript properties and methods, right, and functions. I'm also going to show you how to make a generic component, which means that it's a component that doesn't specifically have data types built into it that it uses by itself. And that's most reusable components are going to be generic components. All the DevExpress components, for example, are generic components. So I'm going to show you how to make those. So as far as security, the authentication and authorization that this uses is ASP.NET Core Identity. So it therefore uses the Entity Framework Core to modify, create, build, and access an authentication database based on ASP.NET Core Identity. And we're going to build API controllers to handle registration, login, and log out. And the login is going to return a JOT token, a JSON web token, which contains all the claims and all of the things that you need to prove yourself. And then the client saves that in local storage. This technique I learned and pilfered proudly from Chris Sainty, with permission, of course. He was happy to have me include it in this. He did this great blog post on it. It's very easy to do authentication authorization with Blazor Server. You just check off the box, hey, I want to use auth, and that's that. But if you're doing something on Blazor Client, it's not so simple. So I was really glad to see Chris's blog post detailing how to do that. And I essentially took the components from that and customized them to Band Booker. Okay, so let's go look at Band Booker right now. You guys having fun? Yes, 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 we are. We're having fun. This is how geeks do the apocalypse right here. What are we calling this? The Corona apocalypse? Oh, yeah. Absolutely. This is fun stuff. All right, so I'll get rid of this guy, and I will load up Band Booker. Where are you now? Here you go. I'm just going to run this guy to start, and we'll use the application. I'll show you the features of the application, and then we'll dive into the specific parts in the code where those features are implemented. Sound good? I thought so. You can see this is the same, pattern that I used before, where I have both a WebAssembly and a server-side implementation. Now, the login, log out, and register screens when you're on WebAssembly you have to build them yourself. You don't get the sort of baked-in UI that you get on the server side. So this header up here, I had to build myself. The register link, the register page, I had to build myself. The login page, I had to build myself. So the moral of the story here is you don't have to have these up here. You don't have to have a register page if you don't want your app to be able to register people. I just wanted my app to be able to do that. But you may also just want to have a central admin that does the registration, you know, sends you your password, and then you log in. So logging in, once you log in, then you can see all this stuff right here. So let's look at this stuff. What does it do? Well, we have a list of instruments, and you can see that the edit and delete buttons are disabled until I actually select an instrument. And then if I click, say, edit, notice that the select itself, the list box, is disabled. And also that the word keyboards is highlighted. It is not only selected, but it's focused and selected. So in JavaScript, you do .focus and .select. I'll change that to keyboard. If I do a new instrument, notice that it's in focus, the blinking caret right there. Okay, that is not something that Blazor does by default. You have to write JavaScript to do that as of today. Actually, as of today, I don't know, Dan, did you guys bubble up focus into the component model? Because that would be cool. But as of yesterday, you had to write JavaScript to do that. And I'll show you the JavaScript interop that does it. Okay, so I'll just create one here. Conga. Okay. And so there you go. Yeah, I can delete, obviously. I can edit. I can add new. So all the CRUD stuff is right there. Musicians, it's the same way. And if I create a new musician, now just like before, this is a component. It's an, yeah, setting UI still requires JavaScript interop, but we expect to address that in .NET 5. Awesome. I knew you guys were on that. So this, everything in gray right here is a component, musician editor. And this part right here is the generic component. And you probably have seen this before. Let's add Che, and I'm going to double click on congas and add that to the list of selected instruments. It removes itself from the list of all instruments. And of course you can swap back and forth, but any one instrument can only be in one place. And I know you've done this UI a million times if you're a developer, whether it's in a Windows application or a web forms application or JavaScript. This is a common pattern for user interface. And it also has the same features as before, except that it's got this interop layer. Now here's one thing that you might not know. Let's edit, say, keyboard, and I have, and you can see it updating here in the list as I type. If I go over 50 characters, boop, name is too long. That's because I have an input validation rule that says the maximum length is 50 characters. And by the way, I also have a rule that says it's a required field. So if I have nothing in it, it says the name field is required. If I've got too much, it's too long. And update doesn't work. All I can do is cancel. All right? So let's dive into all of that stuff. Let's start with authorized view. So we have this authorized view. Underneath we have two tags, authorized and not authorized. If the user is logged in, they're authorized. And we can show all the UI for the instruments and the musicians. If they're not authorized, we see this, please register or log in to use this app. Seems easy and simple enough. Let's look at this code in index. And also you notice that there's no code block. That's because I've moved that to a file called index.razor.cs. So this is code behind. This is the first thing we'll show. So in order to move code to a code behind or a class file, you give it the same name as the Razor file with a .cs extension. You have to make it a partial class with the same name and inherit from component base. And all of your fields have to be at least protected if they're going to be accessed by that UI. Protected or public. Whereas they can be private if they're in the Razor class code block. The Razor file code block. All right, let's go back here. Here's my list of instruments. It's a select. HTML. @onChange. Means Blazor. OnChange happens when you click on an item. Instrument selected. Let's look and see what happens there. So in my code behind, my instrument selected passes a change event args. I get the instrument ID from the args value. Now why is that? Because the value of my option equals the instrument ID. So then I have this selected instrument that's defined at the module level up here. Selected instrument. And where am I? So I pull that out with a little bit of link from my instruments collection, and I accordingly enable or disable the instrument edit buttons. Pretty simple stuff. Here's my buttons. I have a button for new instrument button click, to say edit instrument button click, delete instrument button click. And below that, I've instantiated an instrument editor. And this is a component that I've created that is going to let us edit an instrument. Notice I have this @ref equals instrument editor. That instrument editor is a variable of type instrument editor with capital instrument editor. All right. So that's how I grab a reference to this instance of the component. And now these are parameters. I'm passing the instrument, the selected instrument, and a whole bunch of events. Cancel pressed, instrument added, instrument updated, component updated. Let's actually look at instrument editor. So this is where the validation comes in. You can tell because I have an edit form and some validation goop right here. So this is an instrument, so it starts with the annotations. If I look at the instrument class, you can see I have the name property. I have a required annotation here. That means it's a required field. And a length. Maximum number is 50. Now I could do stuff like this. I could have an email property, and I could decorate that with an email address annotation. And then the form would validate against it being a valid email address or not. And you'll see, actually, I have this login model. Or where is it? Login, register model. Yeah, register model, which I use to register myself. Yeah, email address. So if it's not a valid email address, it's not even going to let you register. That's pretty cool. All right, so getting back to my instrument editor component, I've got an edit form, which is a Blazor construct, a Blazor component that basically encapsulates everything that I'm going to do editing and validating against this particular model. You specify the model, and you say what method to execute when everything is valid and the submit button is pressed. If the submit button is pressed and it's not valid, obviously we're going to have problems. This is not going to be called. The data annotations validator says we're going to validate against those annotations, not against anything else. And the validation summary is the stuff that's in red. And I can put that anywhere in the UI where I want it. The instant input text. Okay, so this is 3 levels deep. It could be this, right? Input. However, the standard input element doesn't know anything about validation. So the Blazor team created this input text, which is an input subclass that knows about validation. And so when you type stuff in, it's going to, look through the validation, the validator, pass it through there, and if there are any problems, go through the validation summary. Problem is, the reason that I had this instant input text, which is my own thing, is because the input text itself didn't let me instant wouldn't let me add that bind event equals on input to it. Didn't work. So I asked Steve Sanderson about this, and he gave me this code. He says, yeah, try this. Just make a new component, call it whatever you want, and here it is. You're going to inherit from input text, and you're going to add this bind event on input attribute there. And that's all it is. So it gives you the validation of an input text with the keystroke by keystroke validation that I really wanted. And then I've got my submit button, type submit. I also have a cancel button. Notice that and you probably know this if you've done any web stuff, but if you don't say type equals button, this will be treated as a submit button. So you got to say type equals button. All right, let's talk about JavaScript interop. First of all, this instant input text, I had to give it an ID, something I could identify it because I'm going to call JavaScript and I need to identify this thing. So instrument.name is the ID. When in the index file here, I want to create a new instrument, I call a new instrument button click. And remember I had that ref to instrument editor. This is my reference. Now I'm calling the new instrument method on that component. So in the component itself, in the instrument editor, I'm calling new instrument. So I create a new instrument. I set the submit button text. I set a Boolean. And I set show instrument panel equals true. Up here, the UI only gets displayed if that Boolean is true. All right, so this is how I show and hide the panel with that Boolean. Now the problem is, well, first of all, let's not talk about the problem yet. Let's talk about the interop. So I'm calling this setFocusJavaScript method, and I'm using this JS object, which is injected at the top of the page. It's an IJS runtime type, and JS is my reference to it. And so now I've got to have a JavaScript method called setFocus, and I'm passing the ID, instrument name. And it's invoke void because it doesn't return a value. Otherwise, I could call invoke async of type that I want to return. But where is that JavaScript? All right, well, it's in two places. On the client, it's over here in index.html under www.root. On the server, it's here in _host CSHTML, and it has to be the same in both places because this is the environment that the application is running in, right? Has to be the same. You have to have the same services. The JavaScript has to be in both places. Interestingly, this is a way that you can tell whether you're running on the client or on the server. Just make a method, a JavaScript method, that returns either client or server but has the same name, and then call it from your UI. Not that you ever need to know that. You probably know exactly where you are when you're running. But in this case, where we're doing both of these things, that's a good way to figure it out. So look at this code. I've just added a script block underneath the standard Blazor server.js. And I've got a setFocus method, passes the ID. And now instead of just calling document get element by ID and setFocus, I have to call this with a timeout. And I'm setting an initial timeout of 10 milliseconds. Here I'm trying to get an element reference. If I don't get it, I'm calling myself again in 10 more milliseconds. And if that doesn't happen, I return. Otherwise, my element is not null, and I do a focus and select, and the stack is all cleared up, and everything's good. So here's the reason I have to do this. Here in new instrument, I show the instrument panel, right? And then I call this set focus, but this element doesn't exist in the DOM yet. It's going to take this code exiting, another rendering, and maybe even another trip to the server. I don't even know. And then, after I don't know how long, 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, I don't know. It doesn't take that long, but you can see that it does take some time. Now, somebody asked me, there is another way to do this, and somebody showed me. Well, they didn't show me, they suggested it. There's an override that you can do on the component model. Let's look on the component model itself. And all pages and all components inherit from component base. And if you look at that, one of the virtual methods is a set parameters async, and there's also a on set parameters async. I'm sorry, after render. On after render and on after render async. And so this is about lifecycle. So the first one that happens is, and I won't do the async ones because they're redundant, but on initialized happens first, all right? And then after the parameters get set, you have on parameters set. And then after the page is rendered, you get on after render. So they said, why don't you just override on after render, or the async version, depending on what you need, and everything will be fine. You could do that. Okay. And the way you do that is protected override void on after render. And here I could just call my JavaScript whatever. Now the problem with that is every time the page renders, it's going to set focus to that field. I don't want that. And now I have to do all sorts of logic to figure out when to call that JavaScript. I know exactly when to call it. I want to call it right here. That's the only time that I want to call focus, right? So I think my method works, and it works well. And, somebody has yet to show me a better way to do it. And maybe Dan can. I imagine he could. So the next thing is the musician editor, which has this object picker, our generic component in it. Let's take a look at that. The object picker is a generic component, as I said before. And here's what makes it generic. At type param t item. This becomes our type that will be defined when a parameter, and it's also got code behind, so when a parameter that passes that an object of that type is defined. So all items, this will be a list of instruments in our case. Selected items, the musician's instruments. All right, so then we know t item is instrument, but it's generic, and we don't know until we actually set those parameters. We have a t item selected item, and we also have methods for retrieving the value and the text using reflection. Item value passes the item. We have a value property name property, which would be ID, and a text property name property, which would be name. And the rest of it happens automatically. So here's all items, which is all instruments. Selected items, musician instruments. The item type and item type plurals, just strings, so that we show in the UI. These are the list of instruments. Text property name is name. Value property name is ID. We have a component updated event, and that's it. So if you look at the object picker markup itself, it's just a table. And we have on the left a list of all items In the middle, the buttons, and on the right, the list of selected items. And all the code deals with getting values into one place or another. Update button enabled states, all items, remove all items, add selected item, all that stuff. It's just generic code. Okay. So let's talk about deployment. The obvious things, they might not be obvious to you right now, but the things that you'll have to do is obviously move databases to production, your credentials to config files, change your URLs and strings accordingly, take the magic strings out, put them in config. And if you're deploying a Blazor server-side application to Azure, you need to enable WebSockets on your Azure App Service. It's off by default. So just go into Azure Portal, go to the App Service configuration, the options, look there, and enable WebSockets is just one of those things. Okay. Before I bring Dan on to answer some questions, I want to talk to you about some DevExpress free Blazor components that are going to make your life easy right now. You can go to devexpress.com/free Blazor and download them. They will be free for you, these things that you download today, forever. You can use them forever. Although newer versions, there will probably be a licensing model in the future, so now's the time to get them. And they're great. They're great. We've got the stuff that you don't want to do yourself, such as data grids. I don't know about you. I don't really feel like writing a data grid. I didn't even really feel like writing an object picker, frankly, but I wanted to exercise my brain and do that. I don't want to write a scheduler. I don't want to write Google Calendar. You know, if I can just use a component, great. I don't want to have to write charts. And also, you might consider primitives like a multi-select list box to be something that you could probably do just like I did a list box there. But it turns out to be a lot harder than it seems on the surface. And so we're going to show you some of those things, starting with the just this beautiful scheduler control. Let me show you this. And by the way, DevExpress, these guys have been in the business for 20 years. A long time. I'm just going to go back to their, here we go, the scheduler. So these guys have been in business for doing components for 20 years. They started with Delphi controls. So, and they still support those Delphi controls to this day. That's what kind of company they are. So again, they're doing things that are difficult that you don't want to spend time doing. Check this out. This is essentially dropping Google Calendar into your Blazor application. And it works on Blazor Client, works on Blazor Server. I can add new appointments, start time, end time, whatever. A location, description, save it, and where'd it go? I don't know where it went. I think because it's 9 to 5, it's off the charts now. So there we go. Now look at and I can also delete, right? I can delete an appointment. I can click on it. I can edit it. Really, really beautiful stuff. This is all that's, this is all that's required to instantiate that. This is all the markup right here. This is all the code right here. You just wire it up to your data source and boom, you've got essentially the functionality of Google Calendar in your application. That's just insanely cool to me. And these are the kinds of things that I would pay for, let alone use a free component for. The data grid examples that you can find here on devexpress.com/Blazor. They're simple. Yeah, they don't, the look and feel is pretty simple, but you can also style with Bootstrap. So they're sensitive to those things as well. Just really great stuff. Now, what I'm going to show you now is an application that we wrote. It's a band booker. It's the band booker application, but instead of using all that UI that I showed you with the object picker and all that stuff, they're doing the same thing just with two DevExpress grids. So here I can create a new instrument, and I'll call it conga. And now I'm going to create a new musician, Che, and I select the instruments this musician plays. I got a drop down. Here's conga. Here's keyboards. And you can see the ones that are already there aren't in the list anymore. And I'm done. I can delete. I can delete here. I can edit. Right? All of the stuff that we could do functionality-wise in that big application that I showed you, Band Booker. Let's take a look at the markup. Here's the markup for instruments. Here's the markup for musicians, a little bit more because we had to have that edit form in there to support the instruments. Let's look at the code behind. This is the code for instruments. This is the code for musicians. Oh yeah, that's called getting stuff done, right? If I just need something to let somebody safely, securely enter some data and manage a data set, this is very, very easy to do. So I'm going to show you another thing. Remember I told you about the multi-select list box, right? Here's an application where I've got 3 pages. One that does my, the basic thing I did in Band Booker. It's just a list box that has a single select. It's a single select. If I hold down Control, nothing happens. And this is my coronavirus shutdown reading list. Practical Snow Melting for Fun and Profit, How to Shave a Cat, and Winning at Tic-Tac-Toe. These are books you might want to read while you're under quarantine from the coronavirus. Now, I did find this really cool application out there. It's a blog post, handle select list in Blazor, in other words, multi-select. And this guy on medium.com named ASHKE98, I don't know his or her real name, but they basically figured out how to make a component to do multi-select list. And that's what this is. So I'm holding down Control here and clicking around. And you can see I've got all of the items that are shown up there. Now, the reason that I have to do that is because I can't just on a select here say multiple and expect my selected event, my change args event isn't going to give me anything except the last one that I clicked on. So I have no way of finding out which items are selected and which are not in here. So it turns out that it's not a simple thing to do in Blazor right now. Now let's take a look at the markup for this guy's or this girl's, this person's solution for select multiple. The markup itself is pretty small. However, let's look at the component that they built. Here they're using, it's a generic component. They're using JavaScript interop. We've got a select, we've got multiple, we've got an on change. And what they're doing is they're hooking this and hooking in JavaScript, hooking some JavaScript to show, to figure out what's selected. And then they're actually calling this on option select from JavaScript. So look at the JavaScript itself. All right, there's some serious goo in here. Here's the window.dropdown, the custom select. We've got several layers of if, else, a lot of cyclomatic complexity, code that is quite frankly a little bit scary for me. And there's a lot of it, right? So yeah, that's what's required to do a multi-select list box. Now, wouldn't it be nice if I could just have a component that somebody else developed that, you know, would make it easier for me, to even easier than this, to do a multi-select list box. And for that, I'm going to bring in my friend Don from DevExpress to talk about it. Hi, Don.
Hey, Carl. That was a decent amount of work getting that multi-select feature enabled. But fortunately, there are easier ways of doing so by using the native DevExpress Blazor controls. And let me show you how simple that works. I have this page over here, and I have only prepared this property which will hold the selected books of the list box. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert the DevExpress list box here, where I will bind the data to the book service, and I'll specify a text field name, which will be in this case the property name, which will be displayed inside the list box. And then the last thing is I'm going to bind the selected items of the list box to the selected books property of the page. And this is basically all we need right now. Let me also include the code that you've seen before. There is one difference though, and that is instead of cycling through this list with IDs and stuff, you can now cycle directly through the selected books collection. And you can write out those property names straight away. So it's again a bit less code here.
Yeah.
And once I run the application, let's see what happens now. If I go to the DevExpress demo, what we'll see is that we have the same UI as we had on the previous pages. The only thing right now is that if I hold down the Shift key or the Control key, it still selects one. And that's actually quite simple solved, because right now the list box is in single selection mode. If I go back to the code and I'll add a property which I will change to the list box selection mode multiple, we're all set. So let's run a demo again, and I will now be using my Control and my Shift key as well. And what you'll see is I can select items individually,
Nice.
or deselect them, or I can even hold the Shift key to select the whole batch. So that's quite simple, huh?
Yeah.
And there is one more thing I'd like to show, and that is setting another property. And that property is going to be show checkboxes. I'm going to put it to true, and now all of you may guess what this will do. So let's run it again, and what we have now is a really nice list box with checkboxes. And for single selections, I don't even need to hold down the Control key, but I can still use the Shift key if I want. So if I want to select the whole batch, I'll just hold down the Shift. So a very nice and powerful control. And yeah, if
great.
we check the amount of code that was needed to get this desired UI, I would say this is too much, right?
No, it's not a lot of code at all. Thanks a lot, Don.
You're welcome, Carl. And we'll talk later.
All right.
Bye.
See ya. Bye-bye. So there you go. I think that it's worth it. It's certainly worth free, but definitely worth it even as an investment to, to find a control vendor that's dedicated to Blazor and dedicated to constantly innovating and coming up with these new things. Let me go back to my slides here. There's a couple ways to run the DevExpress Blazor demos. You can go online and run them like I did here, or you can go to the GitHub repo DevExpress and download them locally. You need to configure a private NuGet feed, which you can do in Visual Studio very simply. You install the NuGet package from them, modify your hosts underscore host CS HTML. HTML file on the server, or if it's client-side Blazor, the index HTML, and add this link right here to the CSS file, and then you add to your imports Razor using DevExpress Blazor, and you're off to the races. Some other resources that they'd like you to know about: the Blazor roadmap, where you can keep up with the latest developments, the community portal to read about new discoveries and hear blog posts, and get in touch. Blazor at devexpress.com is your lifeline to DevExpress and everything that they're doing with Blazor. So Dan Roth, I know, is here somewhere. Just hang on one second, Dan, and I will get you patched in. Dan is why? Oh yeah, participants. I gotta get that off the screen. Just trying to get everything set up for Dan so that he can join us. I know you have a lot of questions for him. Dan, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and we will soon be able to see you. Now we can see you. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Carl?
Fantastic. So, are there any questions for Dan? I know there must be.
Hopefully a few. I've had to field a few in the chat, which has been great. Lots of great questions.
I'm going to interrupt your page just for 1 second to pull this over here, because I noticed that I can't see the YouTube questions right now. So I have to go onto that page and get them. So continue. If you have any questions for Dan, type them in. I know that you guys have already been asking him a lot of questions. So
let's see. While people are typing questions, I saw there was a comment that there was some echo. So if the echo is still there, let me know. But we have done some recent releases of Blazor WebAssembly that if you haven't seen, you'll definitely want to check out. We did a release just a little over 2 weeks ago that added support for token-based authentication using OpenID Connect with Identity Server, and I'm still hearing echo. Okay, let me try something here. I am wondering if maybe because I'm hooked into every single channel on this, trying to answer people's questions.
All right, I think the echo is fixed now.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We added support for authentication.
What did you release today? That's a great place to start.
Well, today we released a preview 3 of Blazor WebAssembly 3.2, and that includes support for debugging, which you mentioned. You can now download the latest version of Visual Studio, create a Blazor WebAssembly app. Blazor WebAssembly is actually included in the box with the latest preview of Visual Studio 2019 16.6.
Okay.
It's even included in the SDK for .NET Core that's shipping with that version of Visual Studio, and will soon be available on the .NET site. So you can just F5 that Blazor WebAssembly app and then debug into your .NET code running in the browser, your component code, as well as simultaneously debug any server code that you might be running on ASP.NET Core or .NET Core. And you can even step into any JavaScript code that you might have at the same time. So you have a full
you can step
debugging
into
experience.
JavaScript code?
Yeah, that's how it works. It's actually plugging into the script debugging infrastructure in Visual Studio. So it connects to the browser through the script debugging infrastructure. It adds a special debugging proxy so it can handle debugging the .NET code. And then when it encounters JavaScript code, well, that's the bread and butter of the script debugging infrastructure. So that works just as normal. And then the .NET debugger handles dealing with the .NET code running in your on the server in your .NET Core process. So you get a full debugging experience.
Wow, that's great. So, a couple of questions here. Dan, when will you guys have a drag and drop widget interface to save us some time?
Yeah, we want to do that in the .NET 5 timeframe, actually.
Really?
We have a set of components or APIs that we'd like to provide in the .NET 5 timeframe to try and reduce the amount of JavaScript interop that you have to do today. Earlier, you mentioned setting the UI focus. We expect to just give you an API for doing that in .NET 5. Drag and drop is another one. File upload. These are all just common scenarios for web development that today require a little bit of JavaScript interop. We'd like to just give you an out of the box experience.
Right.
So look for that by the end of this year, and previews coming after the May release. You shouldn't expect to see much happen with Blazor WebAssembly in the .NET 5 previews until after the May release is done, because we're completely focused on getting that first release out. But afterwards, we'll move the Blazor WebAssembly stuff into .NET 5, and then you'll start to see more improvements come into the .NET 5 previews.
Oh, that's great. So, you mentioned to me before we started recording that the component model is completely baked now. And when we say everything's going to be baked in May, that means all the plumbing code, right?
Yeah, that's right. The component model is the part that you use to write your UI components. So that shipped with .NET Core in both .NET Core 3.0 and then again in 3.1, which has a long-term support lifecycle. So that API is baked. Can't change, won't change.
Yeah.
We want to leave that as a solid foundation that you can build component libraries on top of and not have to worry about breaking changes. The things that are still changing right now with Blazor WebAssembly is the hosting model code, the part that takes those components and runs them in the browser. So like how you start your Blazor WebAssembly app, how that hooks into an ASP.NET Core app for hosting that application.
Right.
Those are the APIs that we're fiddling around with, doing the final touches on, so that they'll be done and baked by the time we ship in May. But your component code, that should be completely unchanged.
I've heard a lot of people that want to take an existing, say, MVC application and just start chipping away and adding Blazor pages to it. Can we do that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Blazor is intended to be used in conjunction with ASP.NET Core, MVC, or Razor pages. There's two sides of the wire, right? Like there's the code you run on the server, and we've always had a great story for building web apps using server rendered code, like with MVC or Razor pages.
Mm-hmm.
And then with Blazor now, we have a way to run code on the client. But you often do those two things together. Like maybe you have some pages that make sense to do with MVC or Razor pages, but you want to add a Blazor component onto that page to add some interactivity. That's what the component tag helper enables, and that's absolutely a supported scenario. You can replace pages in your MVC app with a Blazor-based page so that the whole page is now has that interactive feel of a SPA-style application. They're meant to be used together.
Yeah. There's a great question here. When will it be totally awesome and could rival Angular, React, etc.? I say right now. It's already better than Angular. If I never
in
have
many
to write
ways, we
another
hope that it
freaking
is.
line of JavaScript again, I'll be a happy man.
I mean, to speak to that point though, like it is fair that Angular, React, a lot
Yeah.
of these JavaScript frameworks have been around for a while.
Yes.
They are very mature, and
Yeah.
and if you like JavaScript, those are great frameworks to use. Blazor is a newer framework, but we are taking advantage of a lot of the learnings of that Angular and React have gone through and applying those to Blazor. A lot
Yeah.
of things in Blazor were inspired by existing JavaScript frameworks, but also trying to give it that .NET feel, that integrated feel with your tooling, with the build system, so that you have a complete end-to-end experience.
Can you talk, and this is another question here, talk to Blazor WASM client performance? Like as opposed to, have you done any metrics where you've done, tight loops with JavaScript versus tight loops with C# and measured the time?
Yeah, so Blazor WebAssembly is obviously based on WebAssembly, which is this low-level bytecode for the web. And WebAssembly is all about perf, predictable perf in the browser. So the runtime that you're running on in Blazor WebAssembly is a .NET runtime implemented in WebAssembly. So that's good. Currently that runtime is an IL interpreter based runtime. It's interpreting the .NET IL instructions. That isn't great for runtime performance. There's no JIT that's happening on the fly to take that .NET IL and somehow magically turn it into WebAssembly for you. Maybe at some future point, the specs will enable enough functionality so that could be implemented. But right now, that's not really a feasible direction. Instead, what we're looking at in .NET 5 is supporting ahead of time compilation
Okay.
to WebAssembly, where you can take the hot paths of your application, pre-compile them all the way down to WebAssembly, and then download those with your application so you get that native style performance for those paths. So yeah, Blazor WebAssembly in May won't have AOT compilation available, which means you're probably not going to want to implement like a ray tracer or any like really performance critical paths directly in the browser. You should offload those either to JavaScript code that you're running in the browser or to server code that you then call with an API. But in the .NET 5 timeframe, we expect to address AOT compilation to WebAssembly to
Well, a ray
address
tracer
those
is an extreme
scenarios.
example, but have you seen the Asteroids game for WebAssembly?
I have. I've played the Asteroids
Oh
game. Yeah,
my god.
Blastroids is what I call it, right?
Oh my
Yeah, I mean,
god.
you can
So,
do a lot with the runtime that's there.
right.
Most scenarios are just fine. Like they're not a problem at all. It's really when you're trying to do something really CPU intensive, like if you wanted to deserialize like a really giant file or, write a Bitcoin miner or something in the browser.
Right.
Those are scenarios that aren't going to run particularly well at this point with the current runtime. But in .NET 5 with AOT, that becomes possible.
Wow, that's all very cool. Have you seen any games that were sort of graphically pleasing that were written in Blazor WebAssembly? I mean, the Asteroids thing was compiled WebAssembly, right? I don't think that was Blazor. Was it?
I thought that one was done
Oh,
through
maybe it
Blazor. They
is.
might have had some. I have to go look back at the implementation to see how that was done. I mean, granted, that was mostly just line drawing, so certainly
Right.
not a 3D rendered game.
But
If
it's
you
still
want
pretty
3D
cool.
rendering and like a rich game experience with .NET, you probably would just start looking at like a Unity based offering.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's what they do, and they have taken a big bet on WebAssembly as well and enabled their engine to run in the browser. If that's really what you're looking for, that's probably the direction I would steer you.
Do you have a
But at the
wrapper
same
for the
time,
canvas?
what's that?
Do you have a wrapper for the canvas?
So there is a implementation of Skia, like the low-level drawing library for that gets used for like Flutter and a bunch of other platforms
Mm-hmm.
provided by Google. The Mono team has done a .NET wrapper around Skia called Skia Sharp. That is used in a variety of contexts. I hear that they're working on also a WebAssembly based binding for that library. I think even the folks that work on the Uno platform are using that implementation in some of their stuff. So that's one direction. I know of other community projects that have done like OpenGL or Canvas-based wrappers using JavaScript interop in Blazor applications. I mean, again, for if you're trying to do something with a really high frame rate where you're hopping back and forth through that JavaScript interop layer, I don't know if that's going to be the best solution for you. But it's certainly something that is technically possible.
So this isn't something that's on your radar. You're going to leave this up to the community, the more graphics things.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like, it's not an area we expect to tackle directly in
Mm,
the Blazor space. We're more going for the standard DOM manipulation style applications and web applications with Blazor.
right. Other question. Well, they're kind of having their own discussions over here on YouTube, and I'm looking on Twitch. The questions have sort of died down. I guess. Um, I guess I can ask this. May is around build time, so should we assume that the big announcements will be at build?
That would be a good assumption. Yes, the the release is a May targeted release, and yeah, we are targeting to build as hopefully to have a big splash with a Blazor release. We're pretty excited about it. Things are going really, really well. Folks are, of course, working from home right now, and that creates its own wrinkles. But right now, everyone is healthy. Everyone's doing fine. We hope you are too. And yeah,
Yeah,
we're excited for May.
that's great. All right, there's a question. Will there be a solution to the problem of using Entity Framework Core with lifetime set to scoped inside a Blazor server-side project? I've noticed that there will be a multi-concurrency problem if two or more components of the same page try to execute a query at the same moment, like during the initialization. Currently, the solution is changing the EF core lifetime to transient.
Oh, that's interesting. So the scope in a Blazor app is a little bit different than your intuitions might initially be if you're used to ASP.NET Core.
Hmm.
In ASP.NET Core, the scope is going to be like a request. So a request comes in, we create a dependency injection scope, and then when
Hmm.
you ask for scope services, you get an instance for that for the lifetime of that request. With
Right.
a Blazor server app, the request is, well, a SignalR connection.
Yeah.
You did an initial request to establish that WebSocket, and then it just hangs there
Yeah.
for pretty much the lifetime of the that user's session. So when you ask for a scoped instance of a DB context, you're going to get that one instance over the course of the lifetime of the app. If you do have things that are like overlapping, I guess, in terms of concurrency, then I can see that could be create problems. There is a concept in Blazor where you can create a owning component, where
Hmm.
the component defines a scope just for its lifetime. So you can create components that basically define their own dependency injection scope, and then inject like a DB context into that component, so that DB
Wow.
context will only live for that component's lifetime. That may help with avoiding those concurrency issues.
Yeah, I know this is um, not the best for performance, but I found for concurrency, the only way for me to use Entity Framework is a sort of a singleton service where essentially I have static methods that uh, just new up the context, get data in, get data out, and not do any tracking at all. Because that's sort of the problem, right? Isn't it? That Entity Framework sort of pigeonholing into this web framework. It doesn't necessarily track well. I mean, it's great for a desktop application, or even then, in a Windows Forms application, you run into concurrency problems. But I find the whole idea of tracking in a Blazor application to be kind of problematic.
Yeah. I mean, it's really just a question of making sure that you're accessing the DB context in the appropriate time frames, like not
Right.
having overlapping components doing same things with it at the same time. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's an interesting problem. It's not the first time that's come up from users, so
But it's
maybe
definitely a
something that we could get a GitHub issue on and have more discussion about what the community would like
right.
to see
I
us
think
do
it's
there.
just something that guys like me need guidance on rather than, it's not something the technology is set up to do. I think it's doable. I just found that after struggling with it for so long, I was just like, just new up DB context, get your data in, get your data out, and close it. It's not the most performant thing, but it does work.
Sounds like a perfectly viable solution.
Yeah, sure. All right, so let's see. A question for Dan. Is Microsoft using or going to use Blazor in its products?
Yes, I mean we already use it today. It was funny for a long time. Well, even currently, like while Blazor WebAssembly is in preview, we generally don't recommend putting it in production.
Right.
You can, of course, if you'd like. We just tell people please test, make sure it's you're happy with the current set of features and any issues that might be there, and please be ready to upgrade to newer preview versions as they come out.
Right.
But of course, we then went ahead and put it in production ourselves.
Of
The
course.
in the .NET documentation, there, if you go through the C# tutorials, there's an in-browser experience for learning C#, running some C# code into the browser and hitting run, and then it will compile that code for you and execute it in sort of like an interactive console. That whole experience is implemented using the try.NET technology, which is built on top of Blazor WebAssembly. It wasn't originally implemented that way. It was originally implemented where they would take the code that you typed in and they would ship it to the server. They compiled it server side, but then they had like a container pool that they would use to run that code on the server in an isolated way, which, as you can imagine, was a fairly expensive way to run Hello World like over and over again, hundreds of times. So I think the VP like found out about it and said, is there something we could do to make this a little bit more financially manageable? And they
Yeah.
said, well, we could use Blazor WebAssembly, but that means using this, preview thing. And she was like, yeah, go for it, let's do it. And so they rewrote the implementation so that the DLLs that get compiled server side are now brought down to the browser. They get executed in the user's browser, in the browser security sandbox. So it's got its own isolation there, and there's no load on the server, and saved Microsoft a bunch of money, so we're not running Hello World so many
Yeah.
times on servers. So that's one usage. There are a bunch of other teams internally that are either exploring or using Blazor today to write applications that are used internally at Microsoft. Try.net is the big one that I'm aware of that's actually exposed publicly, but there are other people that are looking at it as well.
That's very cool. Well, Dan, thank you so much for spending this time with us, and you hung out for the whole 2 hours too. I'm really surprised. I'm surprised you're not like falling over.
It was
And
fun.
also to Beth Massey, who's in the chat room. Thank you, Beth, for being with us. And what can I say? It's been a great night for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, DevExpress, for hosting this. This was a lot of fun. Thanks everyone for attending.
You bet. All right, and that means that I can go to my final slide, where I'm going to encourage you all to go to devexpress.com/freeblazor and get your free DevExpress components right now. Use them forever, and give us some feedback and let us know exactly what you think. And with that, I say thank you very much. From my desk to yours, this is Carl Franklin signing off.